On October 20, 1942, the United States government seized the assets of a New York bank called the Union Banking Corporation. The reason? The bank had been laundering money for a German industrialist who had helped finance Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Sitting on the board of directors of that bank, as an active partner, was a man named Prescott Bush, the father of one future American president, the grandfather of another. And here's what most people don't know. Prescott Bush was not alone. He was not even unusual. Some of the biggest names in American finance and industry spent the 1930s doing business with Nazi Germany, building the trucks that carried the Wehrmacht, providing the fuel that powered its planes, and moving the money that armed the Reich. Most of it was perfectly legal. All of it was documented. And most Americans have never heard the names of the men who did it. This is the story of Wall Street's deal with Hitler. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you 3 things. 1. The exact government order, filed in the Federal Register, that documents the seizure of a Bush family bank as an enemy asset in the middle of the Second World War. 2. How one of the most prestigious law firms in America, Sullivan and Cromwell, spent 2 decades quietly representing German corporations, and how its 2 most famous partners went on to run the CIA and the State Department. 3. Why the same dual loyalty pattern that Wall Street ran with Nazi Germany is running right now, in 2026, with sanctions that are supposed to isolate Russia, but somehow don't. Because when you understand how this actually worked in the 1930s, the paperwork, the shell companies, the plausible deniability, you understand how it still works today. Stay with me. Let me start with the document. On October 20th, 1942, the United States Office of the Alien Property Custodian filed Vesting Order Number 248. It was 1 paragraph long, and it seized every share of a New York bank called the Union Banking Corporation, all 4,000 shares. The order specified that the bank was owned, in substance, by Fritz Thyssen, a German industrialist who had been one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most important financial backers. The bank had been laundering Thyssen's money into and out of the American financial system for nearly 2 decades. The 7 directors of Union Banking Corporation were named in the government's record. One of them was E. Roland Harriman. Another was his brother, W. Averell Harriman. A third was a man named Prescott Bush, a partner at the investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman, and the father of a future president, George H. W. Bush. The government's own filing described what had happened in plain language. Union Banking Corporation was a front. Its actual owner was an enemy of the United States, and it had been operating in the middle of Manhattan for years. 2 weeks later, on November 17, 1942, the same office seized the assets of another Bush-Harriman company, the Silesian American Corporation, for the same reason. The seizures were legal, they were public, they were reported in the New York Times. And they were also, almost immediately, forgotten. But how did we get to a place where a future president's father was sitting on the board of a Nazi-linked bank in the middle of New York City? Let me take you back. After the First World War, Germany was broken. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed reparations so massive that the German economy collapsed under them. In 1923, Germany experienced one of the worst hyperinflations in human history. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark in 1914 cost 200 billion marks by the end of 1923. The German middle class was wiped out, savings evaporated. Whole families lost everything. And into that vacuum stepped Adolf Hitler, whose beer hall putsch in Munich took place in the same month. The Weimar government was desperate. It needed foreign capital. Immediately. And the only country in the world with capital to spare was the United States. Beginning in 1924, under something called the Dawes Plan, American banks began lending massive sums of money to German municipalities, corporations, and the Weimar state itself. Between 1924 and 1930, American investors poured over $3 billion into German industry. The country that rebuilt Germany between the wars was not France, it was not Britain, it was the United States. The Wall Street banks at the center of that rebuilding included Dillon Read, J.P. Morgan, Chase, and, quietly, an investment bank called Brown Brothers Harriman, which is where our story picks up. In 1926, a young investment banker named Prescott Bush joined the firm of W.A. Harriman and Company. In 1931, that firm merged with Brown Brothers to become Brown Brothers Harriman. Prescott Bush was a partner. The firm's German business was extensive. It had helped finance German industrial giants. It had underwritten German bond issues on the New York market. And through a subsidiary called the Union Banking Corporation, it was quietly moving the money of one specific German client. That client's name was Fritz Thyssen. Thyssen was one of the largest steel and coal industrialists in Germany. In 1923, he had been one of the first prominent German businessmen to give money to the Nazi Party. Over the following decade, he became one of Hitler's most important financial backers. Thyssen was so open about his role that in 1941, after he had fled Germany, he published a book. It was titled, quite literally, I Paid Hitler. For years, Union Banking Corporation served as Thyssen's American front. It moved money between his German steel empire and his American investments. It gave him access to the New York capital markets. And it did so with the knowledge and involvement of its directors, including Prescott Bush. When the U.S. government seized the bank in October 1942, it was not punishing Bush personally. It was closing down an enemy financial asset that had been hiding in plain sight since 1924. Prescott Bush's shares in the bank were held by the U.S. government until 1951, when they were returned to him along with a compensation payment of around $1.5 million. He was never charged with a crime. He went on to become a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. But he wasn't the only Wall Street figure with these entanglements. At 48 Wall Street, in the offices of a white shoe law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, two brothers spent the 1920s and 1930s building the most extensive German corporate practice of any American law firm in history. Their names were John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. Sullivan and Cromwell represented some of the biggest names in German industry. I.G. Farben, the chemical conglomerate that would later manufacture Zyklon B for the death camps. Krupp, the arms manufacturer, and dozens of German banks and industrial firms. The firm helped these clients issue bonds on the New York market. It structured their American subsidiaries. It handled their legal affairs during the years when the Nazi Party was quietly consolidating power. The Dulles brothers themselves were not sympathetic to Nazism personally. They were corporate lawyers doing corporate work for corporate fees. But by the mid-1930s, the discomfort inside Sullivan and Cromwell became severe. In 1935, after intense internal debate, the firm closed its Berlin office. John Foster Dulles is reported to have wept when the vote was taken. The two brothers went on to have the most extraordinary careers in the American national security state. John Foster became Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower. Allen became the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency and served for 8 years. The men who had spent 2 decades quietly working the American-German corporate pipeline were now running American foreign policy and American intelligence at the height of the Cold War. Wall Street was the money side, but there was also an industrial side. Ford Motor Company had opened a German subsidiary called Ford Werke in Cologne in 1925. Throughout the 1930s and into the war, Ford Werke produced trucks that would carry the German Wehrmacht into Poland, into France, into the Soviet Union. In 1938, on his 75th birthday, Henry Ford was personally awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Nazi Germany gave to any foreign national. Hitler kept a framed portrait of Henry Ford on the wall of his personal office in Munich. General Motors was even bigger. In 1929, GM had purchased the German auto manufacturer Opel. By the mid-1930s, Opel was Germany's largest carmaker. During the war, Opel produced the Blitz truck that became the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics. It manufactured components for military aircraft. It manufactured components for bombs. Both Ford Werke and Opel used forced labor from concentration camps during the war. And here is the astonishing part. After the war, both Ford and General Motors filed compensation claims with the United States government for damage to their German factories from Allied bombing. Both were paid. Now here's why this matters in 2026. The Trading with the Enemy Act, the same law that was used to seize Union Banking Corporation in 1942, is still on the books. It has been used in dozens of sanctions regimes since. And yet the exact same pattern that ran through Wall Street in the 1930s runs through global finance today. In 2012, HSBC, the largest bank in Europe, paid a $1.9 billion fine for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels and helping Iran evade U.S. sanctions. In 2014, BNP Paribas paid a record $8.9 billion fine for processing transactions on behalf of sanctioned Sudanese, Iranian, and Cuban entities. Since 2022, when sweeping Western sanctions were imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, investigators have documented case after case of Russian oil, Russian metals, and Russian money continuing to flow through Western financial and industrial channels, rebranded, repackaged, rerouted through third countries, but still flowing. The names change, the paperwork evolves, the pattern doesn't. Multinational finance has always had one loyalty above every flag it flies. It is loyal to the deal. It is loyal to the counterparty who is willing to pay. And it will find a way around the sanctions of any single government, because it is bigger than any single government. That is what Wall Street was in the 1930s, and that is what it still is today. Now let me be very clear about something. Nothing I have told you tonight makes Prescott Bush a Nazi. It does not make George H.W. Bush a Nazi. It does not make Ford or GM or Sullivan and Cromwell architects of the Holocaust. What it does mean is that during the years when Adolf Hitler was rising to power, rearming Germany, and preparing for the deadliest war in human history, some of the most respected institutions in American finance and industry were doing business with him, not because they wanted him to win, but because it was profitable and because they could. The system that allowed it is still operating. The names have changed. The math has not. If this story is new to you, leave 248 in the comments for Vesting Order 248, so I know you made it to the end. And subscribe, because the next video in this series is about a resort hotel in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, where 730 delegates from 44 countries sat down to design a global economic order, and how the man in charge of the American delegation was, at the exact same moment, a suspected Soviet agent. I'll see you there.